Okay, well, we're going to get rolling here. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Tissue Testing for Success. Thank you so much for joining us. Tissue testing is something that we've been using throughout the years at Aberhart Farms and at SureGrow Solutions under the mentorship and leadership of Elston Solberg. And then, of course, at Aberhart Ag, we've been using it to really verify the sulfur in the plants after biosol application. But it tells us so much more than just the sulfur content, as we're going to learn today. And I wanted to start with a quote here from Elston. Elston tells us, if you tissue test old leaves and new leaves of a plant, you will learn way more about physiology of a crop or a plant than you will from a university course. So hopefully you're going to get even more than an education could provide at one of our fine universities here in Western Canada. So in the next hour, we're going to talk to a panel of experts that will help you make informed decisions about your fertility on your farming operation. Hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll have a really good idea about how to approach tissue testing in your crops. So throughout the webinar, we would love your participation. This is a very open, interactive format. So you can put your comments or questions into the chat, or you can get into the Q&A, and I will interject and ask that of the panelists, and you can also just raise your hand and we could go live if you're so brave. But really the format is today I'm going to interview Greg Patterson from A&L, and the folks from SureGrowth are going to pepper that conversation with some of their experience and how they're helping clientele. So Greg Patterson, CEO and company founder of A&L Canada Laboratories, is with us today. I've had Greg on the podcast. Usually I keep it quite succinct on the podcast, but we were over 2 hours, I think, in our conversation. He's just an awesome veteran with almost 4 decades of experience in the business. And really his passion is around soil and plant nutrition to maximize crop productivity for producers. He's the founder of A&L Biologicals as well. And perhaps we could get into a little bit of that at some point, highlighting Greg's vision is to understand soil health, the microbiome, and develop innovative solutions for global agricultural challenges. So I think you're going to be blown away by what Greg has to share about tissue testing and agronomy and what we can learn from this kind of data. Also with us today is Patel, as operation manager of SureGrow Solutions Incorporated. Deep holds degrees in microbiology and biochemistry. He has experience as an assistant breeder at Agrosoma. He's managed nurseries and conducted research globally, including in Chile and Australia. So that's really exciting. As well with us today is Fritz Brits, sales manager for SureGrow Solutions. Fritz is a genetic graduate from the University of the Free State, specializing in plant breeding. He's got almost 20 years of experience managing research operations. In the past at Monsanto at Bayer, he brings significant expertise to the conversation. He grew up on a mixed farm in northwestern South Africa. So that's a very interesting life experience, but he's making his home in Langeberg, Saskatchewan now. And Fritz has cultivated various irrigation field crops and raised Santa Gertrudis and Holstein cattle. So very interesting and diverse panel, but let's get things rolling this morning. With the experts on the subject of tissue testing, a vast and deep experience here. Greg, can we just start with a very simple question? Why would a farmer want a tissue test?
Well, tissue sampling complements a good soil fertility program and helps the farmer basically look at, where his deficiencies might be in a program he's got in place. More importantly, we really can't balance soil. So we always got something we have to contend with. And based on what Mother Nature delivers us to every year, and just nutrient uptake, and the lack of or too much rainfall has an influence on how plants take up nutrients. And it allows us to, first of all, put a fertility program in place and then use a tissue program to manage the crop in season. Where we use a tissue sample is, I tell growers, think about your tissue sample as being a fuel gauge on that crop. It helps you understand how much fuel you're burning and how much fuel you need to, or how often you have to top up the tank to make sure you get things to yield. If we have a really good crop, let's say we get everything as a beautiful spring, we get everything in a really good condition, and a crop comes on the ground, it's going to start setting up a yield potential. And then we have to manage that yield potential. I mean, from the day it sets up the yield potential, it goes downhill from there. All we can do is use the tools and the experience that we have to make sure that we provide enough nutrition to that crop to get it to finish with the most yield possible. And using tissue samples, particularly in our climate where we have too much water or not enough, when we look at the nutrients like calcium, sulfur, magnesium, and boron that really are taken up by mass flow, moisture plays such a major role. We might have put enough on the ground, but if the plant's not respiring properly, it's not taking it up. So the only saving grace we have there is either some kind of a top dress or, more importantly, in a dry condition, foliar feeding to get the nutrient into the plant and maintain those levels. So tissue sample tells us how much of that nutrient is in demand. Again, when we look at the tissue report, it's a little hard for people to understand a tissue report that are used to looking at soil reports, because when you look at a soil report, it basically tells you how much is in that reserve the plant's going to rely on and what is the optimum level. With a tissue report, it's the opposite. It's not telling you, it's telling you how much is in the tank. So a heavy producing crop will be burning more fuel than a light producing crop. So a tissue sample, if you've done the job properly, getting that crop in the ground and you're managing the fertility properly and set up a really good crop, a tissue sample should drive you crazy. I've had a lot of farmers come to me and say to me that you guys at lab screwed up. Lab's always wrong, by the way. You got to know that. But you guys at lab have screwed up because this is the best crop I've ever grown. And my tissue report comes back says everything's in the toilet. I said, well, pay attention because it's the best crop you've ever grown. And that crop is using fuel like crazy. So I tell growers, think about each one of those little bars on that tissue report as a fuel gauge for that nutrient. And if you've got a long ways to go to get to final yield, make sure those tanks are full. Stop and fuel up. Now, if you're just a week or two from harvest and you've got low levels, you're okay. You'll get there. I mean, you might coast into the finish line, but you'll get there. So think about it as little fuel gauges. And with our PMP program, we actually represent the nutrients in kind of a graphic interpretation. So farmers, if they're doing it, so many times through the growing season, they can see the trend line and the direction the nutrients going before it gets to these, what I call critical low levels, and they can kind of anticipate when they're going to have to fuel up. So if you use a tissue sample program properly, what I tell growers you want to do is you want to make sure that you're staying above that deficient zone for as long as possible, because once you drop below that critical zone, you can't bring it back. All you can, it's gone. But if you top up the tank when you're in the low sufficient zone, you're not causing any critical damages. You're keeping where you need to be. So that's how you manage it. And as you said at the beginning here, looking at old leaves and young leaves, an old leaf actually becomes a little bit cannibalistic to the plant, and it's using more energy than it's providing back to the crop. So it's telling you kind of what happened and what kind of reserves were there in the past. Where a young leaf is going to have high levels, and it's telling you kind of what's going on to get that young leaf. And the young leaves are adding more to nutrition and developing a photosynthase for productivity in the plant than the older leaves, because they're actually contributing. And in a good foliar program, if we look at what I call leaf feeding program, so it can just be a simple triple 20 because we're not trying to gain anything, just trying to keep sugar flowing. We can actually trick that young plant into being younger for longer, so it's contributing longer to the nutrition of the plant before it gets to what we call the plateau zone, where it's kind of coasting. So there's a lot of things we can do when we understand the difference between an old leaf and a young leaf. But typically when we sample a plant, now we've got information on what part of the plant to sample for all kinds of different crops. But when you're going to the field, what you're looking for is typically the most recently matured leaf, because that one is still very productive. It's still offering a lot to the plant. And that's the leaf we want to gauge by saying that we want to keep that leaf at the sufficient to high sufficient zone for as long as we possibly can. Now, key indicators for yield are potassium and phosphorus, obviously, because they're going to help convert phosphate, ADP, into ATP. And that energy drive is really what we're looking for. So if potassium and magnesium fall off, we're losing productivity. If boron falls off, we're losing the ability to cycle or move the photosynthates from the leaf to the fruiting bodies or roots because it maintains the phloem. So there's a lot of things when you look at a tissue sample that help you understand what is going on in the mobility of the nutrients in that plant. And some of these nutrients you'll never get ahead of. I mean, with phosphorus, we want to start up in high sufficient zone with phosphorus. But if we're doing a really good job, because that's the driving engine, phosphorus will take a deep dive and it will just head south really fast. And some people say, well, what's going on here? Well, have you got the right magnesium to make that happen? You got the right level of phosphorus? Where's your pH? All kinds of things interfere with the utilization of phosphorus. But if you're doing things proper, and you've got good phosphate levels in your soils and you've got good balanced nutrition, phosphate should take a deep dive right about reproductive stage and just keep going south. And we have ideal levels where phosphorus has to be maintained where we're building yield. And if we drop below that, you're done. So again, if you've done a really good job, either your agronomist on the farm or you, the farmer, a tissue sample can drive you absolutely nuts.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there just in the opening statement. And I hope that we get a lot of challenging, interesting questions from some of the extremely experienced agronomists that I'm seeing on the call. But I'd like to just open it up to Deep and Fritz here on that point. Are tissue tests keeping you up at night? Are they driving you nuts? Or how would you guys assess the initial comments here from Greg? Fritz, did you want to take a crack at it?
Yes. Dan, we definitely encourage our clients to do tissue test at different stages in the crop, and that way, like Elston, our big friend, told us that tissue test is like taking a blood test at the doctor. You might look on the outside, you might look very healthy, but once the blood test results come in, it speaks for itself. It speaks for what's really going on in the plant. And so I like that analogy that Elston uses. So we encourage our clients to do several tissue tests in the growth season. One early on to just get baseline numbers where we can react if there's some deficiencies in the plants, and then as soon as the plants start to rapidly grow, that's when we typically take the second test, and then just before flowering is the third test, where those are the three areas that we concentrate on getting these nutrient levels, so Greg, I would like to know, if we are testing at those three levels, are there some indicators about mobile and immobile nutrients in the plant, and what do we look for in regards to the mobile and immobile nutrients?
Okay, your timing is perfect, except I would suggest you also don't neglect the crop after flowering, because you've got to finish this crop. But you're absolutely right. In the first few stages before we switch from vegetative to reproductive growth, we want to make sure we've got all the fuel tanks topped up, because once we get to reproductive growth, we have a real hard time changing, especially potassium and phosphorus. And a lot of people don't realize that when I look at a key indicator of how well a crop will do, potassium primarily is my yield indicator. Early high potassium levels are really important. The reason I say that is most crops use potash through the growing season, about 1 pound of potash per pound of nitrogen. But in the early stages, while this crop is actually producing a yield potential, for every pound of nitrogen it's using 3 pounds of potassium. So that kind of indicates to you how important potassium is to set that up. Now, if my directive in producing a high yield crop, and I want to back off from high yield, I focus on quality. If you get quality, you get yield. And potassium, again, has a lot to do with quality, reducing insect infestation, disease, all kinds of things. But if I get my potassium up to where it should be, I get my best yields. Now, if potassium is low, let's say I'm sufficient, but on the lower side of where I know my optimum level should be, I can actually put good applications of potassium on. This usually comes in a cold, wet spring when we're not getting it from the soil properly. And if I got an early tissue sample, particularly for grain, that comes in a little bit low in potassium, getting out there with a good foliar potassium carbonate or even top dressing with something like K-Mag can really stimulate better potassium levels. But to change a percent potassium or even a percent phosphorus is almost impossible because we're talking about, other than micronutrients, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of ppm to change that. But if I can maintain that potassium levels to and stop the drop, so that when I move into the next range of potassium, going to the next stage of growth, and you'll see it come actually in the range, I've done amazing things, if that makes sense to you. So when you look at tissue sampling around the world, a lot of tissue samples are mid-season tissue samples, and it's kind of an average of the global averages. Our tissue sample ranges are based on field information, based on production, focus on quality again, levels, and we have ranges of tissue samples right through the growing season, right to the final seed. And the idea is to try to maintain levels within those ranges. And like I said, once we get to flowering and once we change gears from vegetative to reproductive growth, at the very best we can do is just maintain. And like I said, if you got a good crop, it's going to go south. But I just want to keep topping that up to make sure we don't run out of fuel before we finish this crop. And one of the hardest ones to maintain is phosphorus and boron, because it just is difficult. So yeah, your timing is perfect. You really have to concentrate in those early stages. But let's say in the early stages, I've done everything right. I've got a beautiful crop coming. You've taken 2 or 3 samples before flowering, and in your mind, everything's perfect. But Mother Nature throws a lot of curves at us, and you might have a really good crop. Don't get complacent, because you might have a crop load that's so great that there's no way in the environment you have that crop will finish, because you might be lacking moisture or whatever. So we're not going to get it from the soil, or the soil typically just does not have the ability to deliver for that crop load. So you're going to have to supplement through foliar applications or top dress just to get it there. So don't walk away. Biggest problem I have with growers that do a good job is, they walk away from the crop. They've already put an order in for mother's new truck, and everything goes south.
Right? Can the tissue test tell us whether we should be ordering a new Ford or a Dodge or a GM?
Exactly. Greg,
Go
I
ahead,
have a
Deep.
follow-up question to what you just mentioned to Fritz. So a low amount or deficient amount that we see on tissue tests, does it mean that there's a low amount present in the soil, or the low amount present in plants? Like, how does that translate?
It does. It could mean both. We could just not have enough nutrient available in the whole reservoir, but we could have enough in the soil, but just not getting into the plant because of the demand that I've got there. When you look at nutrient uptake, we got to think about the coefficient of diffusion, and that's the ability for a soil to liberate or give up nutrients through growing season. Moisture has a lot to do with that. So you might have a lot of reserve there, but just not have enough being released. Look at like even potassium and phosphorus. We only get something like 1 or 2 pounds of K released per day. And depending on your base saturation level, it can be 1 or 2 pounds, or it could be 2 or 4 pounds. So base saturation of the cations, and our P saturation number on our report, is just a poor man's way of calculating a coefficient of diffusion, because we don't incorporate water into that. So we're trying to anticipate what the soil is going to liberate over the growing season. And then using a tissue sample, we are basically compensating for that poor ability for the plant to get the nutrient from the soil. And that could be because of just restrictions in total nutrients. It could be because of drought. And it could be just because the crop load's so big, the soil is just not liberating enough of that nutrient at that given time. The other thing I get on tissue samples looking at soil levels, and I have a lot of representatives from companies that are providing nutrient solution foliar programs. and they'll put a test program together, and they'll apply their product. It might be zinc or it might be manganese, and the tissue sample comes back lower than the check. And this is what drives people crazy. Well, if the plant really needed that nutrient and I apply it, I've all of a sudden stimulated a lot more biomass, and I could see that nutrient drop because I'm driving the crop. And this is another thing that drives people crazy when they use a product and they do another tissue sample and it comes back, and lo and behold, that nutrient dropped. Well, it dropped because I now woke the crop up. I've pushed more potential, and the crop's using more fuel. So again, when you do something, you want to come back and check that, because you could have created some of these things, or you could have put something on it, like in the case of the transition metals, the micronutrients, you might put zinc on and further depress manganese, or vice versa. Or in the case of manganese and magnesium, when we identify we got a magnesium deficiency and start foliar feeding a lot of magnesium, because it's really critical for ADP and ATP production and chlorophyll, it competes with manganese. So now we see a manganese deficiency, which could bring in more disease. So you really have to look at the action and reaction, and understand this relationship. And you guys are big in sulfur. Sulfur's a good guy. Every time I put sulfur on, I increase the uptake and availability of most of the nutrients, except for molybdenum. But I can stimulate nutrient uptake and use, which stimulates more biomass. And you could put sulfur on and see a lot of nutrients drop. They're not dropping because sulfur's interfered with that nutrition. Sulfur's actually enhanced the uptake, but now you're seeing the limitations in the crop that you're growing, if that makes sense. So this is why I say tissue samples can drive you absolutely bonkers. But if you
sounds complicated.
No, it's not. Keep the concept, it's a fuel gauge.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to ask you on that, Greg. Okay, if the tissue test is the fuel gauge, in that analogy, what is the soil test? What is the SAP analysis? What is the soil health test? How would you coach the agronomists and the producers on the call to integrate the different sources of data?
How many hours have you got?
We have 38
First of all, the soil
minutes.
sample tells us what our overall reserve is. That's the media. That's what the plant's growing in. And to do things right, the better the balance of nutrition in the soil going forward for P and K and calcium, magnesium, all the nutrients, the easier it is for me to grow that crop. Because we also got to keep in mind, we can foliar feed, but we can't feed the crop its old needs foliar, because that's not the way crops are designed. So we have to rely on the soil. So when you think about it, other than nitrogen, because when we put nitrogen on, and we got to get rid of this love affair with nitrogen, but when we put nitrogen on, 75% of what we apply gets into the crop that year if we've done it right. When we apply all the other nutrients, only about 15 to 20% of those nutrients get in the crop that year. So we got to mentally get around the fact that the reason why we have to have our soil in good shape is we're feeding the soil is feeding the plant. So I said that we need a 1-to-1 nitrogen to potassium throughout the growing season, and I can get 75% of my nitrogen needs from what I put on that year, but only 15% of the potassium. That means I've got a big demand on that soil's ability to deliver that potassium load, right? So that's why the soil is so important, why it's kind of the base. Then we look at tissue sample as a way to manage that, and we can top up the tank with foliars, or I use a lot of things like a sulfate of potash or sulfate of potash magnesium for both magnesium and potassium uptake. I get really good response for broadcast application of that material. So there's other ways of doing that, but for the most part, we're relying on some good foliar product to kind of keep those levels where they are in these high demand times. When we look at soil health, our soil health is stimulated by good balanced fertility. So these microbes, and this is something a lot of people don't realize. The carbon source that feeds these microbes is not coming from all that carbon we're putting in the ground. The carbon source that's feeding these microbes is coming from the carbon-rich nutrients that the plant exudes from the root system that feeds these microbes and actually goes out in the soil profile, goes out in the bulk soil and says, I've got things in good shape here, but I need a little more of the Pseudomonas or a little more of these rhizobiums. So it actually sequestrates that nutrient and brings it into the rhizosphere. The plant, if we're doing our job right, the plant has the ability to completely change the microbiome of the rhizosphere. That's the gut of the plant. And in high production systems where we might not have hit the mark with something like boron or manganese or iron, the plant can say, I'm going to produce 150 bushel of grain here, but you didn't give me enough boron. But now you've given me enough resources that I can go find the microbe that can solubilize boron, and I'm going to bring that in the rhizosphere to make up the difference. These compounds are called coumarins that the plant gives off, and it can actually switch the switch to actually go look for those nutrients. But it can't do that unless I have a really good soil health system in place, which is something you work through with balanced nutrition. Like I could spend hours on talking about this relationship between the plant, but what we have to keep in mind, in our wisdom over the decades, we have bred the phenotypic relationship of plants and that microbiome out of them. So they can't identify these bugs that help them. Now, if you look at a weed, you don't have to fertilize a weed, right? You're not going out there to foliar feed a weed. You know why that is? They have retained the phenotypic relationship of these organisms, and they can bring these organisms into their rhizosphere to solubilize all the nutrients they need. They have nitrogen fixing endophytes that they bring in the plant. So they have retained that. We've bred that out of our plants. The only time that our plants can actually kick this into gear and go find those microbes is we have to feed them and help them bring back that phenotypic relationship and bring those into the rhizosphere. We're completely off tissue sampling here, but we got to understand that there's a relationship here to these organisms. When you talk about use of SAP analysis has been around a lot longer than tissue testing because it was just a lot of labs didn't have the resources or the equipment to do tissue sampling. So it's an old method of trying to understand nutrient analysis within the plant using SAP. But anybody who's ever used a SAP analysis and gone out there and tried to squeeze enough SAP out of that plant to actually do an analysis, and I've done it. I've been a consultant in the field and looked at, if I could use this Cardi meter or this handheld little meter to figure out where my nitrogen or potassium or phosphorus levels at in the field, that would be a great thing to have. And I've destroyed so many garlic presses. I use anybody who's using a refractometer. I use a great big pair of needle nose pliers because I can really cramp down on those. But still, I can get a drop or two out. I can't get enough to put into a solution from these small grains to run an ICP and get real analysis. So you got to understand, anybody doing SAP analysis on grains or small grains, they're taking that tissue and they're putting it in a blender with about 500 mils of water, and they're making a smoothie and calling that SAP. It's not SAP, okay? So beware, there's not a lot of good information on ranges on SAP. It's kind of a compare this one to this one, and we got a product to help you. So just beware. It's old technology. I've had growers ask me, "Can you do it, Greg?" Yeah, we can do it, but I'm not going to put my recommendation to it because I don't have the confidence in it. If that helps you make sense of that, it's a cheap way.
I was a little bit remiss. I didn't even ask you about radionics. I mean, that's a whole different field, but we probably won't go there today. We'll focus on tissue tests.
Well, I have a daughter who just got her degree in Chinese medicine, and that goes back years and years and years and using radionics in human health. So if you want a lesson in that, we can spend a couple hours on that one too.
Oh, perhaps that's another webinar. I'm wondering if folks are wondering how to go about this, would you suggest tissue testing more fields or more tissue tests per field?
Okay, first of all, to do a good tissue program, it's just like soils. You don't want to mix samples up because you're going to get an average of nothing. So what we do when we tell people to put a tissue program together is, first of all, you start with a really good soil audit. In other words, you know where your variability is. You have a place on the field where you know it's an average of the field, and you set up a sampling place from that zone, which is, you go to the same spot and you sample tissue within a 15-foot radius of that spot every time you go in there. Because if you start mixing up soil types and tissues or walking the field, you're going to get information back that's not going to give you a lot of solid information because you got good areas and bad areas and average areas all mixed up. And then you have an area that might be a high productive area. You want to make sure you're managing that one different, or a real problem spot. So you might have 2 or 3 locations in the field where you go to gather these samples. Again, that's the field gauge you're looking at, right? So you're going out to these spots and taking samples. People say, how many samples should I take a year? Well, if we're doing scientific research, we're going to take 5 or 6 samples at least through that growing season, because we need that many sample points to get the statistical significance. But if I'm using it as a farmer just to kind of keep an eye on things, that's your call. If you've got a good season, everything's going well, you want to take 2 or 3 just to keep an eye on what that crop's doing. But you might have a real problem area that you really want to keep your eye on the ball, or you might have an area that's really cranking that you want to keep an eye on the ball. Or let's say you've got a high value crop that's really nitrogen sensitive. You might want to sample that crop weekly just to manage nitrogen. So it all depends on the crop. It depends on the conditions of the year. It becomes a tool. It becomes a gauge to understand what that crop's going through the season. So I'm not going to sit here and say you have to have 3. I mean, what you guys are doing, a couple of samples before you switch from vegetative to reproductive, is absolutely keeping the eye on the ball, because that's when you have the most significant impact on that crop. But don't forget about trying to finish that crop. And that's a lot of times where we kind of, we take the eye off the ball and you go back to the field. You're in that field before it went in heading, or just as it went heading. It was a fantastic crop. And then when you go drive by the field a couple of weeks later, where'd it go? Well, it collapsed because it didn't have enough fuel to finish out what it started. So it's a very, it varies depending on field and just what you're trying to accomplish.
How are you folks approaching it there at Sure Growth, Fritz and Deep? What with your clientele in terms of how many fields or different crops you guys are doing for producers that are tissue testing?
Well, we offer it as an additional service to the clients. So most of our testing is client driven. People that wants to know a little bit more about the crop, and so we not only offer it to our clients, but anybody can contact us regarding sampling, and we've got like a fixed fee that to go and collect samples, on request. So people are welcome to contact us if they want to get a finger on the pulse to get things going.
Sure.
And here's another thing from a management standpoint. And I try to explain to a lot of growers, and most growers who don't understand tissue sampling, they don't understand it from the concept of they're thinking about a soil sample again. And I say to them, I says, well, I said, how many farmers have used fungicides? Obviously they all put up their hand. I said, do you put fungicides on after you see the disease, or do you put it on proactive? Obviously proactive. Well, think about a tissue program and a foliar program as a proactive program. I know, and I've seen manganese deficiencies in that field every year. A soil test says I'm low in manganese. I just picking on manganese in this case. So I know those conditions exist. Why do I wait until the crop shows manganese deficiencies before I do something about it? So I say, put together a well-developed fertility program. You can't fix some of these soil issues overnight, but I know they're going to occur. So have a program in place where I'm going to use a supplemental treatment at specific stages of growth to deal with that deficiency before it exhibits itself. So let's say I say, okay, I know this field always has a problem, particularly in the knolls, with manganese deficiency on grain. So I'm going to go and foliar feed that grain crop just pre-boot, just to make sure I've got manganese levels where it should be. And then I'm going to take a tissue sample to see if I put enough on. But in order to do that, before the season even starts, I better have manganese in my shed so that I'm ready to go. Because too often what happens is people take a tissue sample, then they call up the dealer and says, I need some manganese. I got deficiencies. Or they see a deficiency and they say, can you come and tissue sample this field? I think something's going on. Send a tissue sample off. We turn it around 24 hours, but it's already deficient. And the results come back and the supplier says, well, I'm out of manganese. I got to order some in from my supplier. So 4 or 5 days go by again. And then we get it and calls up farmer says, I got it finally. We'll be out there and deliver it. And when can we put that on? He said, well, the next 3 days forecast heavy wind, so we can't spray it. So another week goes by. So we've got to look at it as a more proactive. So I know I've got the problem. History tells me I have the problem. Soil sample tells me I have the problem. So when I plant that particular crop that's prone to that deficiency, have the product in the shed, and based on you guys making recommendations, ideal time to put that on is at this stage, put it on. Then we're going to come out and tissue sample that program a couple days later, or maybe a week later, and see if we have to do it again. And that way you're not running into problems and losing yield and then trying to fix the problem. Putting a supplemental program on after you see a deficiency in a tissue sample, the only thing it's going to do for you is help you sleep better at night. And it might correct some of the fringe areas that are just borderline deficient, which we should have done in the first case. So it's all about managing, understanding your field and your crop based on historical information, and the tissue sample just helps you watch that to see where you're at and the limit of your needs, if that makes sense.
Before we get into looking at an example of tissue testing from Eberhard Farms and essentially grading my absent brother on the quality of his farming, just kidding. We're just here to learn. We have so many great agronomists on the call. I would love to have some questions and feedback for Greg, or even to go as far as possibly sharing a tissue test with us that you'd like to analyze, or anything, questions that you have. But before we look at this tissue test of my brother's, Greg, how do you quantify? I know it's a difficult thing, but how would you quantify the return of this kind of data investment? And I don't know if it's so much the money; it's probably the time and the physical labor. But we should be putting our shadow on the crop anyways, as crop stewards here. What's your opinion on that?
Well, the value of a tissue sample is more than just return on increase in yield. It's also, is the product warranted? I mean, I'm spending, $10, $20 an acre on product. I mean, is that warranted? I mean, a tissue sample that's giving me information on the whole field is like 30, $40. So right away, the return on investment might say I do or do not need that product. So, I mean, that's the ROI right there. If I look at that $40 investment on a tissue sample and I look at how many bushels I have to produce to pay for that, I mean, it's pretty, the ROI is pretty big. I mean, it's pretty easy to see where that actually helps me out. So, I mean, we use it to try to understand what I have to apply and the economics of what I'm applying. And again, I might be choosing the wrong product. I might think it's zinc and it might be manganese, or vice versa. Or maybe I think it's manganese and it's sulfur. So it helps me choose the right product as well.
That's a great point. Can everybody see the screen here, the tissue test?
I can see it. Yeah.
Yep.
Good. Okay, we've got a number of tissue tests here from my brother that have been taken. These are from this year, courtesy of the Sure Growth staff. We appreciate that. So how would you go about reading this, Greg? What are you seeing? How do you interpret this?
Well, first of all, I have real concerns when I get a tissue sample back when I see all the nutrients flatline like that. I mean, this report would tell the grower that everything's pretty well sufficient, so I'm in good shape. But I see a crop that has a lot more yield potential that's not happening here because everything's too good. I would like to see at this stage of growth, P starting to take a dive, K start taking a dive. I'm not seeing that. Now, we asked the question, why? You say this is a pretty decent crop of barley, but decent compared to what? What could this crop really look like if I pushed it coming out the door? Now, I see a real problem here in manganese. What we have to understand with every crop, not just barley or grains that are more sensitive to manganese than most crops, but manganese is responsible for lateral root growth early. Lateral roots contain your root hair. So if I have poor lateral root growth, I do not have the mechanism to take up nutrients as effectively as I should. So I've got manganese deficiency deficient at this stage to a point where I am questioning how good the root growth is in this plant. Now, to pull the plant up, you might say, it looks fine to me, but especially for cereals, it's really hard to determine how good that root looks. So I would say that right from the start, we've had limitations in our root growth here. Not saying that this is a bad crop, but I'm saying that this crop is not showing me that it has super potential.
That is
Okay.
fascinating.
So keep in mind, these are fuel gauges, and this if you're driving a little wee 4-cylinder pickup truck, that fuel gauge is going to stay full for a long time. But if you've got a great big dually out there, it's going to use a lot more fuel, right? Simple analogy. I'm seeing a small little pickup truck here that's not using a lot of fuel.
Terry's going to be so I don't know what he's
But
going to be.
don't look at it that way. I mean, when we look at what Terry's doing and
Mhm.
compared to the average, we could get a tissue sample at this stage that has some major deficiencies because the crop is actually garbage. So he's going to get a pretty decent crop here, but what could he get?
A lot more potential. So when you see something like this, if you see a red bar, is that a panic to go to the local retailer and pick up some manganese, or
Well,
how do you address it?
it's a panic to fix that because it's just going to get worse. But it should also tell me as a producer that I've got inherent manganese issues in this field, and it's causing me yield limitation and root growth early. So I need to get some manganese on this crop to stimulate better root growth early. Now that manganese issue might be because I'm a heavy user of glyphosate, and manganese from the soil is not that available. Manganese I need in this crop here is I need it in that crop in very early stages. So using some kind of a seed dressing or a fertilizer dressing with manganese in it. In this particular case, I would suggest 3 to 5 pounds of manganese in some kind of a fertilizer starter to get that manganese in that crop early. And then from there, this crop should have had a foliar feed about 2 weeks before this.
Okay, well, we'll let Terry know.
But see,
Are
these are things we don't look at and things we don't pay attention to, because how many people look at manganese and its impact on root growth?
Yeah.
It makes my leaves yellow. So I spray it on keep from leaves going yellow. People don't realize that manganese plays a major role in my lateral root growth early in the season, which is going to have a lot to do with yield potential and how that plant forages for nutrients.
We had a comment here from Brent Tarasoff. Thank you. He's wondering if we could see the soil test from this field. Do we have that, gentlemen?
Hello, Brad.
That's probably something that they might have there that they can bring up for.
Yeah.
What are you wondering? What are you wanting to look at, Brent, in that regard? I don't know if you wanted to jump on here and make a comment, Brent. I'm just going to give you the ability to talk here. Brent, what were you hoping to see from the soil test there?
Background levels of the manganese, just to see if it was a predictable deficiency or not.
Okay, background levels to see if it was something you could have predicted from the soil test.
Yeah.
Greg, is that something you can use in conjunction to try and be a little bit predictive so you get better results on your tissue test? Then I guess.
Oh, absolutely. For grain, I want my manganese levels over 33 part per million on our soil test for grain, because grain's really sensitive to it. I mean, I want it over that for all crops, but you're going to see manganese deficiencies even more of an issue in grain because of their response to manganese on most grain or legumes. So it's a concern, and I would probably, as Brent's suggesting here, I'd probably suggest that we're probably not over 30 ppm, or we've done something seriously wrong to inhibit the uptake.
Did you have anything to add there, Brent, before I take you
Nope.
offline?
That's all.
Oh, thanks. Okay.
And that's what I said earlier, when we design a program, our soil sampling, we've done a good job. And our history of, the visual of deficiencies showing up in the field should lead us to putting these programs in place. But more importantly, having a really good, site-specific sample of the field so I can see that variability across the field would probably pick out, in this field, had a manganese problem.
Some
And
interesting.
I don't suppose your brother uses glyphosate, right?
No, he's glyphosate free. He's been liberated from the matrix. No, I'm just kidding. He uses Roundup.
Greg, maybe if you can just give us a little bit more background on what's the effect of glyphosate on manganese. Oh yes.
Glyphosate is a chelator, and particularly heavy duty chelator for manganese, but also potassium and some other nutrients as well. Glyphosate changes the organisms in the soil. It doesn't make manganese disappear, but it gets rid of the organism that reduces manganese from the unavailable form, the trivalent form of manganese, to the divalent form of manganese that plants actually see. So when we use a lot of glyphosate year over year, we will see manganese levels actually drop in the field. Not that the manganese has disappeared, but we lose it as a divalent form of manganese that plant is readily available to plant. It goes into trivalent forms of manganese that's tied up in the soil and not available to plants. And that's just because of its impact on those organisms, the oxidative and reducing organisms in soils. It encourages oxidative organisms for manganese, and it shuts down the reducing organisms that convert the manganese back. So the manganese is still there, but we now have to kind of kick into gear the reducing organisms that bring it back to the divalent form. That's a difficult thing to do without completely looking at soil balancing for microbes. But we need to start adding more manganese just to supply what these organisms are not making available for us.
Jeff Dole had some great comments here about manganese. He pointed out that manganese is also not very flow mobile. So foliar rescues are limited in helping drive that lateral root growth. And also even soil levels can look okay, but if manure microbes are oxidizers of manganese, so tissues will reveal poor availability to the plant.
And he's absolutely right. I cannot stimulate lateral root growth from a foliar application. That's why I have to get it in the field early.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Then I do have available that soil sample if you would like for me to share it with you guys.
Yeah, we can switch over here. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to allow you to share, I guess, or make co-host so that you should be able to share now.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
So your manganese in parts per million is all over the map. So I would be concerned about the variability of this field. But with those levels of manganese, I don't know where that soil sample's from or how that was done, but if that's based on the hydrochloric acid extraction, which I'm suggesting it likely looks like it is, you should have all kinds of manganese available to that plant. So my question here is, from where that tissue sample was taken, is that representative of where the sample was taken from? If it is, what have we done to inhibit manganese availability to that crop?
I'm just getting a note here that folks aren't seeing that soil test, so maybe we'll just take that down, Fritz, for now, and go back to cameras if you can.
Okay.
I'm viewing it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can see it as well.
Well, I mean, just for the audience that can't see that, I'm on over 33 ppm.
Oh, she's seeing it.
And you've got more
seeing
than
it. Elmer Cascu's asking, is there a difference amongst analysis at different labs that measure certain nutrients such as manganese?
Yeah, especially in Western Canada, you have a lot of labs that use DTPA instead of the extraction we use, which is we're representing as a hydrochloric extraction. A DTPA manganese on the report would be half of what the optimal level would be, half of that level we would have basically. So where I'm saying over 30, they're saying 15 to 20 would be the ideal range. In any case, that soil report, either DTPA or hydrochloric, I'm assuming it's hydrochloric. I don't know where that sample was sent to. Aberhart Farms, it probably came to us. So that would be a hydrochloric extraction. So according to that soil test, there should be all kinds of manganese available. So the tissue sample saying it's not, I would still question where the sample was relative to the tissue sample. So because you could have a lot of variability in that field. But I would, if that is indeed the case, we're getting manganese at certain times that are not available. I would definitely make sure we have a good, strong manganese program at planting time so that we overcome that.
It would probably help to soil test and tissue tests in relative the same regions or track that a little bit, I guess, for these kinds of
That's why I'm saying when you have a tissue program, having a site-specific sampled field where you've got either 2.5 or 5 acre grids, that you've got to at least get rid of some of that variability, because we can go from anywhere from having 0 manganese to, like in that case, 95 to 100 ppm of manganese in the same field. And you don't want to see that variability when you start tissue sampling. You want to make sure that you're isolating that variability so you don't mask deficiencies because you've got this blended sample that's, the good and the bad put together. So, the goods can overcome the bad piece in some of these averages. I know you guys are probably more intensive than that, but still, because you've got low manganese in that boot stage tissue, something interfered with manganese availability in that early season.
No. So, Greg, would you say should we follow the same pattern like we do for the soil sampling, where we go back to the similar spot, relatively the same spot year after year to keep it consistent, which is a good representation of the field?
And that's why site-specific sampling is so important, be it a 2.5 acre or 5 acre grid. And some farmers are reluctant to do that because of the perceived cost of doing that. And I say, well, at least do it once so you can understand the variability that you're dealing with. And then you have these georeference spots in the field that you can go out and selectively sample from them year over year if you want to reduce it to 2 or 3 samples in that field. I've never had a farmer do that. They find enough value and have that field resampled that way again in 3 years that they say, no, I want to do it all again, but you missed this spot over here. So I want to fill in that a little more with more intensive sampling. And when you do that, you, again, as I said before, you figure out in your field where you're going to take your tissue sample from based on that site-specific sample that's on like a 15-foot radius zone, and you set up your tissue sampling program from that zone too. So you'll know that you've got no variability existing across that field. So it gives you a management tool to deal with the variability because, I've had people in Western Canada say, Greg, we're flat out here. We don't have any variability. And I usually say, well, humor me, because even though it's flat, we've got a lot of variability. Yeah. And when the results come back, it shows there's variability there. And people just don't understand that even though it's flat, it's not flat underneath. So we've got a lot of contour underneath that is deeper or shallower soil depth or different horizons, anyhow, it's more variable than people think, even though it's flat.
This seems to me like a possible 3-day seminar in person. I know you'll have to teach in person, Greg, but I hope at least it illustrates for some folks all that's possible with the tissue test. We want to start wrapping things up here. Brent did have a comment that he's asking about, was the soil saturated at the time of tissue sampling? So maybe there's a factor there.
That could have a factor on it too.
Yeah. So as we wrap things up here, final thoughts. Maybe we'll just go around the horn and summarize it by sort of providing your thoughts on why you think folks should be tissue testing and what the value that you've seen of it for folks. So maybe we'll just start with Deep and go to Fritz and then go to Greg, and we'll wrap things up if there's no more questions. Deep.
I absolutely see a great value in tissue testing, and I'm a big time foodie, so I always use food analogies. So a good food analogy would be tissue test is a reflection of a diet plan, right? So you have to make sure that that's just not one component that always is critical. You have to look at it cumulatively, and certain nutrients in a diet plan, you see certain outcomes very rapidly, but then there are certain nutrients that takes a little bit of time to come through and to actually see it on your health. So I think that's the same analogy I'd like to take with the plants as well, right? Like you put something in, the next day you go out, it's not going to be instant, but over the period, over the gradual integration, you will see the results. So that's how I want to.
I love it.
That's my tidbits on it. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we have a few foodies on the call. Seems like agronomy and foodies go together.
I know.
It's full circle. What about you, Fritz? How did you see this conversation? How are you thinking about it?
Well, the best thing that I can say is that this is a learning process. We as agronomists and farmers can never stop to learn about our crops and what's going on in the soil. And this is a tool for us to understand the process of the plant generating the crop for us and bettering that understanding. So to me, the tissue test is a tool of understanding what's going on in your crop, and the better the understanding, the better reactive measures we can start to take with our crops. So that to me is the most essential part of tissue testing is you are keeping your finger on the pulse and you are learning a lot along the way.
Yeah, it's constant learning, eh? And this is just a great tool. I can't imagine the learnings over the years and everything that you pointed out today, Greg. I mean, there's just so much involved here. You can try and keep it simple and make it functional, but the learning by looking at this is incredible. So why don't you take us home with your final thoughts on tissue testing, Greg?
Well, I should actually recuse myself of this because I'm tissue sample. But as a consultant and a guy who's done a lot of field research, um, we've got so many um, factors that influence how that crop grows. Every tool we've got that can help us understand what's going on is important. We've got difference in varieties. We've got difference in when we planted it. We've got difference in seed quality. What is the cold germ of that seed we put in the ground? How vigorous was that seed? Um, we've got Mother Nature, and she's a great educator. She's a bit of a bitch, but she's a great educator. So we need all these tools to kind of make these decisions. I've worked in the field lots as a consultant, and I just feel naked going to a field without a good soil sample and tissue sample to help me see what's going on in that crop. Now, a good consultant gets a really good eye, but you've got a couple on the call here, including Brent. I think he'd be the first one to tell you that you just can't go by, what you think you know, because we learn every year. And to have these tools so you can make really good educated decision is important. Uh, so yeah, there's just too many factors that we don't have control over that. Now we're going to our soil health test and trying to understand what's going on in the root system. What are these microbes doing and why is that plant performing the way it should? Because what is going on in the rhizosphere? So I mean, the more we get into production agriculture and the more we push towards nutrient density, as a food quality and just quality of the food we produce and this whole regenerative concept, which I don't think anybody can explain. We want sustainability and we want to have productivity that is economical in the farmer's eyes to produce that crop because we want to deliver the quality for what we're getting paid for. We need these tools. So um, and then it's interpretation. So there's as you said when we started, you put two agronomists in a room together, you get 5 different recommendations. There's a lot in interpreting the data. And who do you believe? The best consultant out there is the farmer himself once he learns how to use the tools because he's on the farm every day. So there's just too many moving pieces to not have the tools at hand to make those good judgment calls. I mean, we're using drones and satellites and algorithms and the technology today to help us do these interpretations and you know um, yeah, it's the technology is helping us, but the more it helps us, the more it confuses us.
Yeah, it just broadens our understanding that we have to learn, unlearn, and relearn, as Elston would say. So I really appreciate you guys coming on the call today. It's been a fascinating expose on everything that tissue tests can tell us, and I'm sure it just whets the appetite of the folks on the call to look deeper. If anybody's looking for more resources on how to tissue test, we have all that. And of course, we sponsor our dealers to do tissue tests to verify that bile cells showing up in the plants like we want it. So it's been a big part of our culture and strategy, and but it's brought all these other really interesting areas and highlighted it. And hopefully the use of tissue tests will grow because that only I think makes folks better producers and more productive, which is and profitable, which is the goal. I think it's a great tool to make money, as you pointed out here. So thank you, Greg, for coming on and lending your knowledge. It is always incredible to hear you speak. It's a huge, huge honor and privilege. So I appreciate that we've been graced with your time and Deep and Fritz, giving us some perspective as well about how you guys use it in your business for your clients. I really appreciate that. And then all the fantastic agronomists that we've seen on the call and producers, um, great alumni from some true experts in their field that I'd also love to pick their brain one day. Hopefully we'll get there. But happy growing season out there. We're going to be at Canada's Farm Show next week, and then we're going to be all over Western Canada in July with meetings at the ground level with agronomists and producers, and Elston will be presenting a lot on our behalf, and also Ag in Motion. So enjoy the growing season here, everybody. Thanks so much, Greg, Deep, and Fritz, and everybody that attended. It was a great conversation.
Yep, likewise. Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
I know.
Yeah.
Bye for now.